It's time for the Roots and Roots Show with your host, Greg Rashid, bringing you history and music from the Black American diaspora. Greg and his guests' goal is to root the show's information in your psyche, providing you the roots to expand knowledge within your community. Now here's your host, Greg Rashid.
Well, I want to say Swaddy Cop to everyone out there. This is Greg Rashid with another edition of the Root and Roots Show. Heard at many people's convenience, whenever you want to listen to it, anytime. And by the way, if you're new to the program, Swaddy Cop means hello in Thai. Yes, I'm in Bangkok, Thailand. I do the show from here. But a lot of folks who aren't in Thailand, but around the world that listen to the show, be it in Britain, be it in Brazil, be it in Bahrain, a little bit of everywhere people listen to the show. A lot of folks listen every Sunday afternoon at 3 p.m. Mountain Time in Colorado on KUHSdenver.com, created by the one and only, that veteran of radio himself, Henry Archuleta. I want to say hi to all my friends in the Colorado region. I keep saying I'm going to get back there. I am going to get back there. I'll surprise you. At least expect it. But anyway, we're going to have a great show today because I know those of you who are listening on Sunday the 19th, Sunday the 12th of November, you're going through the weekend of Veterans Day. And because of that, I'm going to do kind of a special show around veterans in a sense, but it's about Black veterans in particular. And what I'm going to do, and I want to thank first of all the St. Louis County Library for this interview, because I didn't do the interview, but I was able to get it. I want to thank them for it. The interviewer on here is Rod Millam, and he's interviewing the author of a book, Half American. I was really hoping I could get him on and interview him myself, but this distance thing, being here in Thailand, it's kind of hard to get some authors now like I used to. But anyway, the author of the book, Half American, is Matthew Delmont, and he's professor at in New Hampshire, and he's going to talk about the book for the next 29 minutes or so. A great book on World War II and Black veterans of World War II and what happened during World War II, and particularly Double V Victory Campaign. So let's listen to the interview now on the Root and Root Show. You'll learn a lot about probably things you don't get taught in the schools in America as far as history, Black history, let alone American history itself. So let's hear this now on the Root and Root Show.
The official start of the U.S. involvement in World War II against the Axis powers was after the attack on the naval fleet at Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan in December of 1941. When images of that time of war are conjured, the pictures of the Greatest Generation are most likely to come to mind. Troops storming the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, or the raising of the American flag at Iwo Jima. But those snapshots are just that, curated moments in time. They don't fully represent the breadth of the kinds of people who wore military uniforms back then. First off, all of the faces that come to the minds of most are probably white faces. But it turns out that that is not only inaccurate, but it's a deliberate mistelling of the history. Not only did the military service include Black Americans, but they served in racially segregated regiments that had to fight the powers on the home front to be able to fight the war abroad. Distinguished Professor of History at Dartmouth College, Dr. Matthew Delmont, has researched and penned his fifth book, Half American. There, he brings to light the purposely hidden history of much of the Black American struggle at home for the opportunity to fully participate in the Second World War, the struggle while prosecuting that same war, and how that two-front fight led to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s in the United States. Now, a one-on-one discussion with author Matthew Delmont about his book Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad, is next. And we're here today with distinguished professor at Dartmouth. It is Matthew Delmont. Matthew, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
What do you mean by half American? That's the main title of your book when you're speaking about the African Americans or Black soldiers that were fighting during World War II and how they and the rest of the Black population were treated during that time during World War II and just before.
So Half American, the title of the book, actually comes from a letter. It was written by a gentleman named James Thompson, who was a 26-year-old from Wichita, Kansas. He wrote a letter to a Black newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier, in which he asked, should I give my life to live half American? And he went on to ask a number of other questions. This was December 1941, after Pearl Harbor. He was on the verge of being drafted. And he really wanted to know, what does it mean for me as a Black man to potentially be drafted in an army that's segregated and potentially die fighting for a country in which I'll come back and not be a full citizen? That letter helped to launch the Double Victory campaign through the Pittsburgh Courier to secure victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. Double Victory was really the rallying cry for Black Americans during the war. And those words from Thompson's letter, should I give my life to live half American, they really stuck with me as I worked on this book for the past several years, in part because a lot of what he was asking in 1940 still, I think, resonates today in 2022. And so that's why I ended up using a half American as the title for the book.
And you cited a letter being written into Black newspapers. Throughout this entire book, that seems to be a very big source of information for you, the Black press and what was going on during the time. Why did you rely so heavily on that as an actual source for information that you had, and how helpful was it for the information?
So Black newspapers were hugely important to understanding this history, in part because they covered aspects of the war that just didn't show up in papers like the New York Times or Chicago Tribune, the mainstream white dailies. A couple of important things about the Black press: they covered the story at a very kind of local perspective. So if you looked at the Cleveland Clin-Post, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, you see all these profiles of local Black men and women who were drafted or volunteered for the military, who were serving as soldiers or sailors or serving in the Women's Army Corps. These were not famous names, but they were names that mattered in their local communities. A number of the Black newspapers, such as the Baltimore African American, had war reporters. They had war correspondents who went abroad and they were embedded with the Black units. And what was important about that is they wrote about the work that Black troops were doing. A lot of the most important work that Black troops did during the war was really unglamorous work behind the scenes. They were in supply units, loading and unloading trucks and ships and building runways and clearing jungles. But because these Black reporters were there, they could tell the story firsthand and really make the case that these behind-the-scenes roles, while they weren't glamorous, they were crucial to fighting and winning a global war. And so for me as a historian, going back and looking at how the Black press covered it, you get a series of events, of units, and of individual people and stories that just don't come through clearly in a lot of other sources, and as a result, haven't really been foregrounded in the way they should in a lot of other histories.
You start off your book talking about the Spanish-American War. You actually do the intra-war period between World War I and World War II, and the involvement of Black American fighters in the fight against Franco in Spain. Why did you start there, and how did that end up being kind of a jump-off point for you in this book?
And so when you look at the Black press, particularly from the 1930s, as early as 1933, you see really extensive coverage of the wars that are developing in Europe. Black Americans are among the first to recognize the really dire threat that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis pose, in part because they recognize the parallels between what's going on in Nazi Germany and what's going on in the Jim Crow South. The kind of restrictions that are being put in place against Jewish people in Europe, the violence that echoes with their own experience in the U.S. South. And so they are really attentive and alarmed at what's transpiring in Europe. By 1935, when Italy, under the control of Benito Mussolini, invades Ethiopia, that also receives a huge amount of coverage because Ethiopia is the only independent nation in Africa at the time. Black Americans, again, see the real dire threat that fascism poses early on. By 1936, the Spanish Civil War erupts, and at that point you have more than 80 Black volunteers who joined with a group called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade to go fight against fascism in the Spanish Civil War, fight against General Franco's forces. What's important about that is, again, they recognize the threat that fascism poses very early on, and they're among the first to take up arms to fight against it. But also for those volunteers, they're serving in combat roles in integrated volunteer units. At the same time, they would have been in segregated units in the U.S. military. And so for those volunteers, plus for the Black Americans who are reading about the news in Black newspapers, they see a different set of possibilities being articulated internationally than what's true at home. And it leads them to call even more forcefully for the integration of the U.S. military before the start of World War II.
when you're saying Black Americans were segregated in the military, there was segregation throughout the country and not just the South. Can you talk about how that kind of found itself in I guess before the war actually started, and then the actual recruitment of soldiers, both men and then women as well, in what was going on? Because that segregation and the separation really plays a pivotal part, not just in what you wrote, but in the war itself.
Absolutely. So in the lead up to the U.S. entering World War II with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the military is segregated. The Army is completely segregated, and by and large, they're blocking Black troops from taking on any sort of combat roles. Within the Navy, Black men are only allowed to volunteer for the messman branch, where they're essentially waiting on white officers. They're not allowed to serve in any other capacity. And in the Marine Corps, Black Americans aren't allowed at all at the start of the war. It was also a problem once Pearl Harbor happened, because when they wanted to draft Black troops, they didn't have enough Black units to be able to put the Black troops in. And so there were a number of stories of Black Americans after the bombing of Pearl Harbor going to volunteer and being turned away because they had a quota of how many Black troops they could accept to be placed into these designated Black units. And so one of the first real challenges for Black Americans in the lead up to World War II was really to fight for the right to fight. They had to fight to get their way into the U.S. military to serve the country that they wanted to be able to fight for.
And can you talk a little bit about the treatment that the Black recruits actually received?
So in the run-up to the war, the treatment of Black Americans in the military was quite poor. In part, that's because a lot of these military bases were stationed in the South. And so there were a lot of stories of Black men and women being drafted from the Northeast, from the Midwest or the West, and being transported by train to these Army camps in the South, and being forced to go to segregated cars on the railroad trains once they got to the demarcation point that marked their entry to the South. Once they reached these Army camps in the South, then the Jim Crow treatment was true both on base and off base. And so these were often small towns that were not at all accommodating or welcoming to Black troops. The times Black troops had leave for a night or for a weekend, they were cordoned off into small sections of cities. They were harassed if they stayed out past a certain amount of time, and they were generally threatened by the local sheriffs and police.
So can you give an example?
So one example from the book is in a town called Gurdon, Arkansas. It's a small town in Arkansas that really became a boom town during the lead up to World War II. They were doing training exercises there to prepare the U.S. military for the work they're going to be doing during the war. There was a Black unit that was stationed there that was going to be doing work building bridges during the war. And they're in the midst of these training exercises, they had one night where they could go into town. When they went into town, a number of the local white townspeople threatened them to stay in the quote-unquote Black section of Gurdon, to not go outside of this 2-block area. Things ended up escalating as these Black troops were walking back to their camp. They got threatened by the local sheriff. By the next morning, there was a posse of nearly a dozen white sheriffs and deputized citizens who were threatening this Black unit that they had to leave town by the next morning or else. The Black unit was scared because they'd read in the newspapers about some of the violence that had already transpired against Black men in uniform, including a lynching at another Army base. And so by that next night, nearly half of the unit left Arkansas. They hopped on whatever trains they could find to get out of town and try to get back to the base where they were stationed initially outside of Detroit in Michigan. Ended up being a fairly large case that Thurgood Marshall had to become involved in as a lawyer for the NAACP, try to make sure that these troops didn't get sanctioned or court-martialed for leaving their posts. But I think it illustrates the kind of threats that a lot of Black troops felt like they were under, that they actually felt less safe in the U.S. South on these military bases or in the towns than they would have if they were deployed and actually in combat. And I think it's worth pointing out there that because these were U.S. Army bases or military bases, they didn't have to be segregated, that the military had a choice to make. They could have insisted on integration on the bases, or they could have gone against the local prejudices that were in the area. But they chose not to. They chose to take on the kind of Jim Crow segregation that was in the South, and not just have it be true on military bases there in the South, but also have it be true on military bases in places like California, Washington State, Illinois as well. And so there are these decision points that exist during this history where the military could have made different choices, but unfortunately they did not.
Can you talk about that a little bit as well? Because you mentioned the executive order that came through when FDR was in office.
Yeah, so there's an extensive push leading up to World War II and then into the first years of World War II on a couple of different fronts, both to make sure that there's not discrimination in the war industries, because Black Americans, particularly people like A. Philip Randolph, who was a major labor leader, understand that the defense industries are going to mean a huge boon in terms of employment and jobs, and they want to make sure Black Americans aren't left out of that. And at the same time, there's a push to have desegregation of the military. That's true in 1938, 39, 40, 41. What ends up happening is there's enough political momentum, there's enough threat of Black protests that FDR is encouraged, or you could say forced, to sign an executive order that does put in place the framework to try to have non-discriminatory policies with regards to the defense industries. But it stops short of actually having desegregation of the military. He deems that, the military planners deem that to be a bridge too far. They're not willing to take that step.
And to put things in context, why do you think, or were you able to actually find out why Black Americans actually wanted to participate in what was going on with the war?
So there was certainly a small minority of Black Americans who thought, this war isn't about us. And they said so publicly. In some cases, they were conscious objectors who had a religious-based objection to the war. In other cases, they had a racial-based objection to the war. They thought this is not something that Black Americans are meant to be a part of, and they opt out for that reason. But overall, that was a relatively small minority of the overall Black population. The motivations for other Black Americans to serve, I think, were multiple. I think the ones I would highlight were a genuine sense of patriotism, the sense that America was their country as much as anyone else's. In some cases, it was their country more than a lot of other people's, and they wanted to fight for it. They recognized the threat that Nazi Germany posed. They were upset by the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese military, and they wanted to defend their country. They wanted to serve their country proudly. They also recognized a couple things about the military. That one, the military offered jobs training, that there was a set of skills and opportunities that the military was going to provide to white Americans, and they wanted to make sure they and other Black Americans had access to those same opportunities. And I think the final piece, I think this became more clear over the course of the war, that this was recognized at the time that it was going to be a watershed moment in U.S. history. And it was clear that whoever served in the war was going to have access to American identity, American belonging afterwards. They're going to be able to sort of claim this identity as true Americans, so to speak, after the war. Again, Black Americans wanted to be able to lay claim to that. They felt like they deserved it, and they did deserve it. And they understood that military service was going to be a key part of what it meant to be an American at the end of the war.
So let's talk about the actual start of the war and Black Americans' involvement in that. Did the treatment get better right away? Did it ever get better? The
treatment of Black troops over the course of the war got better slowly and painfully. And immediately after Pearl Harbor, I think the thing that changes in that first year is the U.S. military needs Black Americans more than they anticipated earlier on. And so in fits and starts, the Army and Navy find ways to accommodate Black troops and find different branches and different units to be able to place them into. The treatment, though, described by Black troops is still very rough in those first few years, in part because they're being, again, drafted or sent to these military camps that really would prefer that they weren't there. It's a kind of double-edged sword. The military increasingly recognizes their need, but doesn't really want to do anything to actually make it hospitable to them on bases. Over the course of the war, things improve, if only slightly, in part because of the tremendous pressure that Black activists and the Black press bring to bear on the military, that they're constantly calling out military planners and politicians saying, you have to take better care and give better treatment to Black soldiers and sailors, that this is just unacceptable. By 1943, the Marines finally have admitted a few hundred Black Marines at Montford Point. That's an important point because it opens up one of the last branches of the military to Black men. And over the course of the war, again, in fits and starts, you do see some improvements for the treatment to Black Americans, but still, on the whole, the treatment was very poor throughout the entirety of the war.
Do you have any examples, because there are so many that you put forward in this book of what's going on? What are a couple of your favorite examples?
I think there are two examples I would cite. One is a famous one, the Tuskegee Airmen. I think if anyone knows anything about Black Americans in World War II, it's probably the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. But I think it's surprising about that story, and what a lot of people I don't think fully appreciate is how hard the airmen had to fight over the course of the war. First, to get their foot in the door to serve in the Air Corps. At that time, it was part of the Army. But then how much they had to push back against their own officers and leaders. These were white commanders initially who had no use for them. They were really opposed to the integration of the Air Corps, having black troops under their command. And they intentionally worked to try to undermine and undercut the airmen. And I think that is a surprising story to tell, because you would think you're in the midst of a war. Why on earth would you go out of your way to try to undercut your own servicemen, your own the troops under your command? But I think for the Tuskegee Airmen, the fact that they had to first fight to get into the Air Corps, then had to go through training, prove themselves as competent combat pilots, then actually go to war and fight against Nazi pilots, risk their lives, in some cases see their friends die in combat, and then have your own officers disparage you in the press, and then despite all of that, to come back and prove yourself again in subsequent battles in the Mediterranean. I think that trajectory of the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, that it wasn't simply the doors open and then they were successful, but that it was every single day they had to prove themselves, and they had to prove themselves in the face of some white commanders who would prefer that they didn't succeed. I think that's a powerful story about their persistence and their resilience against everything that the military threw at them. The other story I would highlight is the Montford Point Marines. So I just mentioned that the Marine Corps initially at the start of the war was entirely white. They did not admit any black men to the Marine Corps, and they were proud of that fact. The Commandant of the Marines at the start of the war said he would prefer to have a Marine Corps of 5,000 white Marines rather than 25,000 black Marines. So he was adamant that it was only going to be a white corps if it was under his command. By 43, you finally have some black men who are in the Marine Corps. And again, they really had to prove themselves first in training and then in combat. And the work they did in the Battle of Iwo Jima, for example, earned universal praise, both from their white Marine Corps commanders, but also from mainstream magazines such as Time. They rated the performance of the Marine Corps at Saipan and at Iwo Jima as being superlative. I think for both Montford Point Marines and for Tuskegee Airmen, what was important about their successes, they recognized that they were doing it not just for themselves, not just for their own units, but really for all of Black America. That if they failed, there was a potential that it would be generations before Black Americans had these same opportunities within the military.
But there were also support troops, which were by far a much larger percentage and proportion of all of the military in general, not just of Black Americans. And there were Black units that did provide logistics and other sorts of support. Can you talk about maybe the ones that helped support the fight on D-Day?
I think when we think about D-Day, we think about the units that came to shore in the first charge of the morning of June 6th. That was certainly important, and take nothing away from the bravery of those men who fought and died on the morning of D-Day. But D-Day only stood for Day of the Invasion. There was still D-Day +1, D-Day +2, and for weeks and months thereafter, the Allies had to continue moving men and supplies and munitions across the channel onto the beach at Normandy and onto the Cherbourg port. The vast majority of those goods were moved by Black soldiers and Black troops, either at the ports back in England or receiving them at the ports in Normandy or Cherbourg. Once those goods were transported across the channel, it was largely a group of truck drivers called the Red Ball Express, 70% of whom were Black truck drivers, who moved those goods across Europe to keep up with the Allied forces as they were pushing towards Germany. It's actually one of the things that made the U.S. military so dynamic at this period of time, is that they had this vast fleet of trucks that could move more nimbly than the German military could. So this is what allowed General Patton's division, for example, to push so quickly towards Germany. It was really the supply ingenuity and versatility of these Black truck drivers. I think that's a different story of the war than we typically hear. We tend to think about these platoons that were in frontline combat, again, which were very important. But when you take a kind of step back, look at the big picture of things, that supply effort couldn't have been done without Black troops. And that means that the war effort really couldn't have been won without Black soldiers. Looking at other parts of the war, there were units in Alaska that built this 1,000-mile-long Alaska highway to help make sure that there wasn't a Japanese invasion through Alaska into the U.S. mainland. There were troops in China and Burma, who built a 1,000-mile Lido road to provide supplies to the Chinese who were trying to stave off invasions through the Central Asian theater. And then throughout the rest of the Pacific and Europe, there were numerous Black units that did this, again, unheralded, unglamorous, but really vital supply and logistical work that was really clear at the time to military planners and to the Black press that this was important, but has really largely been written out of or has not been foregrounded in most of the histories of World War II. And so one thing I hope my book does is bring these stories, these important stories, back to the foreground.
And here's a really basic question. Why did you end up writing this book?
Several years ago, I was looking at oral history interviews. There's one of a gentleman named Robert P. Madison, who's a Black veteran. This interview was done by the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Robert P. Madison served in the Army. He was in Italy, earned a Purple Heart for his role in combat. After the war, he went on to earn architectural degrees from Case Western, from Harvard, and became a trailblazing architect. He designed the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, among other buildings. But the part of his oral history interview that stuck with me is he described a trip to a bookstore. At this point, he's in his 80s. He's late in his life. And he said he was looking at the section of books on World War II, and he flipped through it. He found these great big books, and he couldn't find anything at all about Black soldiers or Black airmen. He said we were a forgotten group of people. It was reminiscences like that that really led me to want to write this book. That I know as a teacher that we have parts of our textbooks that are about the Double Victory Campaign that will talk about the African-American experience in World War II in small parts. But I knew there had to be a larger story there. And so I wanted to take a big picture look at what did World War II look like from the Black perspective. And so over the course of 6 or 7 years, I've been working on this book. And what I'm most proud of is trying to weave together these various stories, both what was going on the various war fronts of the war, the vital roles that Black troops were playing, but also what was going on the home front. I think too often we tell those stories as two separate stories, but for Black Americans, these were two parts of the same battle. It was really the Double Victory Campaign to defeat fascism abroad and defeat racism at home.
And another interesting thing I think that you did, or at least that you highlighted in the book, there were certain people, events, and institutions that later on went on to further prominence in what's called the civil rights fight in the United States, but all of the seeds of that seem to, or at least the way that you presented it, seem to have come from just before the war and the war period in certain events.
Yeah, I think that the best event that we have that echoes what happens later on in the civil rights movement is the March on Washington movement that's led by A. Philip Randolph in 1940 and 1941. This is one of the best and earliest examples of thousands of Black Americans planning to band together to demand equal rights and demand equal treatment. Over the course of several months, Randolph and allies across the country are planning this massive March on Washington that's meant to both demonstrate Black political power, but also honestly to try to scare President Roosevelt into taking more forceful steps to integrate the military and to have desegregation and anti-discrimination provisions in the defense industries. It ends up being the march gets canceled through negotiation with President Roosevelt for the executive order that leads to the Fair Employment Practices Commission. But it provides the model and the framework for what then eventually does become the March on Washington in 1963. A. Philip Randolph is part of the envisioning of what that march looks like. Bayard Rustin, who's one of the coordinators for the earlier March on Washington plan, he becomes one of the key figures in planning the 1963 March on Washington. And so in terms of events and historical echoes, I think that's one of the clearest examples that we have.
And do you see the participation of Black Americans, women and men, in the effort during the war and the treatment that they received after the war, or lack of good treatment, as a direct line to what happened in the 50s and 60s in the United States?
Medgar Evers, for example, was part of the Red Ball Express. He loaded and unloaded trucks for this group of truck drivers who transported supplies after D-Day. He comes home, and in 1946, on his 21st birthday, he leads a group of Black men to register to vote in Decatur, Mississippi, only to be turned away by a white mob with guns. And that really launches his career as a civil rights activist. He goes on to take on important roles as a leader in the NAACP in Jackson, Mississippi, fighting for voting rights throughout the 1950s until he's eventually assassinated in 1963. I think it's important to note he's assassinated by a white veteran. And so I think his Medgar Evers case, in some case, in some ways highlights the very different visions for what post-war America was going to look like. That Meg Revers and other Black veterans came back wanting real equality. And in some cases, you had white veterans who wanted the exact opposite of that. They wanted to maintain Jim Crow segregation. The other name I would highlight is W. Johnson Roundtree, who was a woman, one of the thousands of Black women who participated in the Women's Army Corps. She went back and earned a law degree using the GI Bill and started an important law firm in Washington, D.C. that won a number of important civil rights cases in the 1950s. And so there's two of dozens of examples of Black veterans who used their military service as part of their motivation to fight for freedom and democracy at home.
I think that other people who are much less well-versed or less well-read around the subject might pick this up and might say, this sounds revisionist. Are you making this sort of information up? Or I think maybe you're highlighting something that wasn't that prominent. What is your sort of answer to that question that might surround the telling that you give in this book?
So my first response to that would be check the footnotes. As a historian, everything I do is documented. You can find it all at the end of the book, sources drawn from archival sources, oral history interviews, or newspaper accounts. And so everything is there and is cited. But I think the question really opens up a larger question about what do we mean by history, or what do we want our history to do? I think it's a really interesting, kind of complex time to be thinking about American history right now, because there are really fraught debates about how we can and should teach American history. I think some people think that history should just make us feel good, that we should only focus on the parts of American history that are essentially the greatest hits, the parts that we can definitely be proud of. History doesn't work like that. Most history are things that we can both be proud of, but also be troubled by. And that's certainly true with this book, that in the book, you'll hear stories of Black veterans. And I would hope that regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, you should be interested in understanding the history of the more than 1 million Black men and women who served the country. These stories of Black veterans certainly deserve to be told, and they are something that I would hope all our country could be proud of and want to learn about.
And you're a professional historian and a professional teacher. Is this something that you teach in your classes, and has the research that you did in this changed the way that you present material in your classes?
What I've often found in teaching this history is that students are surprised by it, in part because the story they've typically been taught about World War II is that the country was a more unified place at the time. And so this really challenges them to think differently and think more critically about this aspect of our nation's history, that it hopefully actually makes them more curious about what was going on in the United States in the 1940s that made these different threads of history possible.
And this is your fifth book. Do you think you have another book in you, and or are you working on one right now? And what do you have coming up in your future?
I appreciate you asking. So I'm in the early stages of doing work on a project that will be about the Vietnam War and the experiences of Black Americans during that war. Not exactly sure yet which angle I'll take on it, but a lot changes between the end of World War II and the start of Vietnam. It's a very different conflict. At that point, the military is integrated, and that war means very different things for America and for Black America than World War II did. So I'm interested in that time period and how I can find a point of entry into a really, really fascinating story.
Dr. Matthew Delmont, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah.
And I want to thank the St. Louis Library for providing that interview. Really enjoyed that. Please get that book by Matthew Delmont, Half American. Great book, understanding the history of Black Americans in World War II. And the thing is, too, there are books out there about the Blacks in the Revolutionary War, Vietnam War, Iraqi War, you just name any war. And the stories are always the same. It's really fascinating. Still fighting for our rights, even right now in the 21st century. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed that interview. And right now I'm going to play, thanks to our friend Clyde here, Clyde being our AI voice here. This is an excerpt from the letter from 1942 from the Pittsburgh Courier. And this is the young man, James Thompson, who wrote this letter about the double V, victory. And just listen to this, and because this set up the whole just change as far as attitudes of Black Americans. Just this one letter to the editor, to the Pittsburgh Courier. So let's hear that on the Root and Root Show.
Being an American of dark complexion In some 26 years, these questions flash through my mind. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Will things be better for the next generation in the peace to follow? Would it be demanding too much to demand full citizenship rights in exchange for the sacrificing of my life? Is the kind of America I know worth defending? Will America be a true and pure democracy after this war? Will colored Americans suffer still the indignities that have been heaped upon them in the past? These and other questions need answering. I want to know, and I believe every colored American who is thinking wants to know. This may be the wrong time to broach such subjects, but haven't all good things obtained by men been secured through sacrifice during just such times of strife? I suggest that while we keep defense and victory in the forefront, that we don't lose sight of our fight for true democracy at home. The V for Victory sign is being displayed prominently in all so-called democratic countries which are fighting aggression, slavery, and tyranny. If this V sign means that those now engaged in this great conflict, then let we colored Americans adopt the double V for a double victory. The first V for victory over our enemies from without. The second V for victory over our enemies from within. For surely those who perpetrate these ugly prejudices here are seeking to destroy our democratic form of government just as surely as the Axis forces. This should not and would not lessen our efforts to bring this conflict to a successful conclusion, but should and would make us stronger to resist these evil forces which threaten us. America could become united as never before and become truly the home of democracy.
And that's excerpts from the letter from James Thompson to the Pittsburgh Courier, January 24th, 1942. Hope you enjoyed that on the Root and Root Show as we get to more kind of music now. And also, but I want to tell you about the next segment of this show. This show is about World War II again, but during World War II, there were a number of radio broadcasts because there's no television then and no internet for some of the younger folks out there. So radio was the main form of listening to programming if you didn't go to a movie. And this show was part of many shows that during World War II to get the soldiers, give them some relief. Listen to some entertainment, some music, some comedy. And this show was geared particularly to African American soldiers. It's called Jubilee. And I'm not gonna play the whole thing, but this is a Jubilee featuring the boxer heavyweight champion at the time, Joe Louis. This is 1942, along with the great singer, actress, goodwill ambassador, activist, civil rights activist, human rights activist, Lena Horne. So let's hear this right now on the Root and Root Show.
A presentation of the Special Service Division of the War Department of the United States to the fighting men of the United Nations. Jubilee! On 6 continents, the armed forces of 31 nations are united in a single common cause. Most of us are new to each other in the lands we are in. We have asked our men from the United States to get to know you and your country better. We would like you to know something more about ours. This series of broadcasts, like many others you will hear, is dedicated to that purpose. And now it's time for the show, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce your master of ceremonies for this broadcast. We in this country have seen him on the screen and as Little Joe in the stage smash Cabin in the Sky. Here he is, Dooley Wilson. Dooley, you're not supposed to applaud yourself.
Mr. Announcer, I'm not applauding myself. I'm applauding because I know what's coming. Just like everyone else will when they hear Lena Horne, Les Height and his orchestra, the Golden Gate Quartet, Wonderful Smith, and Sergeant Joseph Louis Barr, sometime known as Joe Louis, heavyweight champion of the world. See what I mean? But first, unbutton your coat, take off your gloves, and prepare your skin, and get ready to jump, cause it's sizzling time, and Les Heights sends you with spruce juice. The Golden Gate Quartet, professors of higher strata of jive, put you under their spell as they spell Kalamazoo. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. I got a gal in Kalamazoo. I don't want to boast, but I know she's a toast of Kalamazoo. Years have gone by, my, how she grows. I like her looks, but I can't get her looks in Kalamazoo. I'm going to send a wire, hopping on the fire, and leaving today. Am I dreaming? I can hear her screaming. Hi, Mr. Jackson, everything's okay. Oh, what a gal, she's a real pepperoo. I make my bid for the track of the kid time hurrying through. From the Michigan to see the sweetest gal in Kalamazoo.
When Lena Horne totes a torch up to the microphone, be it in front of the camera, on the stage, or in a broadcasting studio, the legits as well as the cats in the know curl up into their never, never land. So get ready to curl, for here she is singing, "The One I Love Belongs to Somebody Else."
You know the one I love belongs to somebody else. He sings his sweet refrain to somebody else. Even when he's got his arms around me, I know his thoughts are strong for somebody else. The hands I hold belong to somebody else. I bet they're not so cold to somebody else. Gee, it's tough to be alone on the shelf, but worse to be loved by yourself when the one you love wants someone else. The one I love belongs to somebody else. He sings his sweet refrain to someone else. Yes, even when he's got his arms around me, he's looking at the door, waiting for someone. I know he's waiting for somebody else. The hand I hold belongs to somebody else. I bet they're not so cool to somebody else. It's tough to be alone on the shelf, but worse to be in love by yourself when you love belong to somebody else.
Attention, all you bugs. Come on up, you small ones, and come on down, you tall ones. There comes that stick man. When he waves it, you shake it. Ready or not, you'll be caught as Les Hype and his orchestra plays Three Bones. There's nothing so good for setting you down when you've been stirred up too high by jive as a good spirit. The Golden Gate Quartet are back again with Blind Fatima, a modern spiritual in an old tradition.
Well, old blind Barnabas stood on the way. Blind Barnabas stood on the way. Well, old blind Barnabas stood on the way, crying, oh, Lord, have mercy on me. Well, old blind Barnabas stood on the way. Blind Barnabas stood on the way. Well, old blind Barnabas stood on the way, crying, oh, Lord, have mercy on me.
In my Lord's Bible, in the book of James, Christ was healing the crippled and lame, giving the poor and needy bread, healing the sick and raising the dead. They tell you when he passed through Galilee, he passed by a man who could not see. The man was blind and crippled from birth, and they tell me that his name was Blind Barnabas. But old Blind Barnabas stood on the way. Blind Barnabas stood on the way. Well, old Blind Barnabas stood on the way, crying, oh, Lord, have mercy on me. When Barnabas heard that my Lord was nigh, he fell on his knees and began to cry, crying, oh, thou man of Galilee, great God Almighty, have mercy on me, crying, oh, Lord, there is baby, oh, Lord, son of David, my Lord, the Lamb of the Lord, there is baby, oh, Lord, there is baby, oh, Lord, there is little bitty baby, oh, Lord, bleeding Lamb, my good Lord, Son of Man. Then my God stopped and looked around, saw Blind Barnabas on the ground. He touched his eyes with the palm of his hand, and Barnabas saw like a natural man. Well, oh, Blind Barnabas stood on the way. Blind Barnabas stood on the way. Well, oh, Blind Barnabas stood on the way, crying, oh, Lord, have mercy on me.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this corner, the heavyweight champion of the world, Sergeant Joseph Louis Burroughs. Say, Joe, I'd like to answer some questions. And the boys out there would like to know the answer. For example, do you like being in the Army?
Mm-hmm.
Well, was it tough making the change from civilian life to the Army life?
No.
Well, do you miss the big crowds and the excitement that surrounded you every time you stepped into the ring?
Mm-mm.
Well, Joe, I understand you were stationed at Fort Riley. That's a cavalry school, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Now, Joe, in your training there, do you find riding horses do as much for your condition as a former mode of training, such as road work, skipping rope, punching bags, and so on?
I think so.
Well, now we're getting somewhere. Now, Joe, when you train for a match, you have to watch your diet very careful, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
For example, as I understand it, when you train, you can only eat certain meals at certain times, whereas the life in the Army is a little bit different. So my question is, has the Army diet affected your physical condition?
Mm-mm.
Well, now, Sergeant, just one more question.
No.
Well, Sergeant, your buddies all over the world are listening. Maybe you'd like to say something to them in your own words.
I have been in lots of fights, but this is only one fight was anybody fighting for now, and I'm proud to be in it.
Well, man, a few words, Joe Louis. Anyway, and that was from the show Jubilee, 1942, during World War II, a show geared to black troops during that time. A lot of the white troops listened to it, but this was basically geared for black troops, and it was only heard in the various military outposts all over the world, and not heard in America and home, in people's homes. It was only years later than these tapes originally were released, so everyone could hear it. So I could like put it on this show and everything. But for back in the 40s, only soldiers heard it. That was it. And just great talent that was on that show. As you heard of Lena Horne, you had Joe Louis on there. On some of these shows, you had Duke Ellington, Count Basie, just a plethora of so many great black entertainers at the time. And later on, after the war, because it went on to like the early 50s, they started incorporating white entertainers on the show too. So you had Frank Sinatra and people like that on the show. But a great show, if you can get a hold of it, it's on the internet. I have a collection of their shows on a CD here. But yeah, Jubilee's a great show. But I'm just happy to do this show today and honor. We'll see who's on honoring Veterans Day on today. If you're listening to the show on the weekend of November the 12th, Sunday, honor your veterans in your home with friends and all, and just remember what they've done for you. And also honor those who have made the sacrifice as far as the families. Honor those who are going through wars right now, because we got, major wars going on all over the world. I got one here in the backyard here. Not in the backyard, literally, but, basically about 4 hours away in Myanmar. There's a major genocidal war going on there outside of Thailand, between Thailand, India, and Pakistan. You got Myanmar. Used to be known as Burma, if you don't know that name. And also, we know about what's going on in the Middle East with Palestine and Israel. Your money is going toward funding that war, and it's just awful. It's just a shame. I just salute those who are getting out in the streets all over the world saying, stop the war. Stop the war right now. Just end it. Just stop this. But anyway, this is Greg Rashid with the Root and Root Show. We'll see you next time. Go in love, go in peace. Help someone along the way, especially in these times, troubled times in a sense, with all these wars going on. Just help your neighbor, help your friend, wherever you are in your prefecture, in your countryside, your community, your apartment, your housing area, wherever you are. Just help someone, especially a senior and young person, because we're all in this together. No matter what happens, we're all in this together. So go in love and go in peace. Check out my YouTube channel, by the way, Nourished by History, where I give you history on nutrition, sports, a little bit of everything. Black history, a little bit of everything in there. But go in love, go in peace. Greg Rashid. See you next time on Root and Root Show. And remember, when you get up in the morning, just hug yourself, looking at the mirror and saying you love yourself. Because if you can't love yourself, you can't love anyone. And those of you who are sight impaired, when you get up in the morning, just hug yourself and say, I love myself. Because you can't do anything unless you love yourself. So this is Greg Rashid. We'll see you next time on the Root and Root Show. And you can reach me on Facebook at Gregory Rashid. So take care. Go in love and go in peace.
Thanks for tuning in. See you next time. And remember, spread the knowledge, share the power.